The relay at Hadron's Gate was the kind of place men learned to hate quietly. A dead magnetar sat at the heart of it, a cinder no wider than an old city but heavier than worlds, turning over twice a second and throwing a field so violent that the instruments aboard most ships read it as a wall and refused to go closer. We had come anyway. We always came anyway. That was rather the point of us. I was the senior fire control officer aboard the heavy battlecruiser Ironwake, and I had stood my watches in that ship for 11 years by the time we made our run on the gate. She was an Anvil-class hull, which meant she was ugly, slow to love, and built by people who did not trust anything. Her plotting tables were brass and glass, and lit by lamps you could shake to bring back if they dimmed. Her gun directors had optics you laid by eye and cranks you turned by hand. Half her crew called her the coffin and the other half called her mother, and after a while you understood that both were terms of affection. We had been sent to the gate because a convoy of ours had gone silent there. 11 hulls, colony tenders, or haulers, a hospital ship called the Marrow with 2,000 souls aboard, bound out along the deep lanes to a world that did not yet have a name, only a number. They had transmitted a distress burst 4 days before we arrived, a single ragged line that said they were holding position and their engines would not answer. Then nothing. In the deep lanes, nothing is the loudest word there is. Captain Mara Quist read the burst aloud to us in the wardroom the night before we jumped, and then she folded the paper and set it under her cup, and she said what we were all thinking. Their engines would not answer. She let it sit. 11 hulls don't lose their engines on the same hour by accident. Somebody turned them off. Nobody in that wardroom had ever seen the Orruun. Very few living men had. But we had read the after-action files, the few that existed, and we knew the shape of the thing that turned ships off. We knew it the way you know the shape of a predator from the bones it leaves. The galaxy, you have to understand, fights with cleverness. Every species we had met out in the long dark fought with fields and lattices and thinking machines that laid their guns faster than a mind could follow. Their warships were elegant. Their weapons reached out at the speed of light and never missed, because nothing made of meat was doing the aiming. For 10,000 years that had been the whole art of war among the stars. Build the clever machine, and the slower machine dies before it knows it has lost. And then the Orruun came up out of whatever cold place had made them, and they had found the joint in all that cleverness, and they put their thumb in it. They called it the stilling. The files were thin on how the Orruun did it and thick on what it did. They came in coil ships, great torrid cities wound about with kilometers of conductor, and when they meant to take a fleet they would build a field, a thing that made the magnetar at Hadron's Gate look like a child's magnet, and they would let it fall across their enemy like a tide. And every clever machine in that enemy fleet would die. Currents would bloom in every circuit. Sensors would blind, then char. The thinking machines that laid the guns would forget they had ever known how. Reactors would scram, drives would void, every elegant lattice of light and logic would simply stop. And the fleet would go dark and drift, full of living crews trapped inside hulls that had forgotten how to be ships, while the Orruun coil cities slid in among the silence and claimed it. In 400 years no one had beaten the stilling. The way you do not beat a thing is to depend, utterly, on the one thing it takes from you. The whole galaxy had bet its survival on the cleverness of its machines, and the Orruun had built a weapon that turned cleverness off. And so the whole galaxy lost, system by system, lane by lane in the dark, without a shot fired in answer. We were not the whole galaxy. We were latecomers and we were poor, and we had spent our short reach among the stars being afraid. Afraid of the dark, afraid of the things in it, afraid most of all of trusting the wrong thing at the worst moment. So when we built warships, we built them like men who expected to be betrayed by their own cleverness, because in our short bloody history we always had been. We hardened everything. We caged every compartment. We ran our linkages in fiber, and in steel cable and in brass rod, anything that did not care what a field did. We put optics on our gun directors and graticules in the optics, and trained men to read range off the width of an enemy's hull, the way an old gunner reads it off the foresight of a rifle. We built reactors you could bring up by hand if the start cards burned. We drilled and drilled and drilled the crews to fight cold and dark and deaf, because some grim old admiral 4 generations back had written a single sentence into our doctrine that every officer since had been made to memorize. Assume the cleverness fails. Plan the battle you will fight when it does. The rest of the galaxy thought we were primitives for it. They were not entirely wrong. The Iron Wake could not have lasted 10 minutes against a first-rate alien squadron in a clean fight, where the machines did the aiming and the light reached out and never missed. We knew that. We had made our peace with being the slow, ugly thing in the corner of the bar. But the Orruun were not coming to fight a clean fight. The Orruun were coming to turn the lights off. We dropped out of jump 400,000 kilometers from the gate, and the Magnetar's field hit us like a fist hits a man who has braced for it. Hard, jarring, survivable. Half the fleet in the galaxy could not have come this close and kept its sensors. The Iron Wake squinted and held and showed me the relay. The convoy was there. All 11 hulls holding station in a loose column the way you do when your engines have died and you have not yet drifted apart. They were dark, not destroyed, dark. Cold hulls, no running lights, no drive glow, the Marrow's great white flank gone gray in the Magnetar's bruised light. 2,000 souls in that one ship and not a lamp showing. And around them, like a hand closing, were the Orruun. I had a long time to look at them, because in a hardened ship you have time. Our sensors did not reach out and paint a picture for me in a heartbeat. They gathered light slowly, the way an eye does, and a rating named Yale built the picture up plot by plot on the brass table under my hands, and I watched the Orruun take shape the way you watch something surface from deep water. 3 coil ships. The smallest was bigger than the Marrow. The largest, the one we came to call the Anvil that sings, though we never learned its true name, was a Taurus 11 kilometers across. Wound in bands of dark conductor that caught the Magnetar light and threw it back in slow rolling sheens so that the whole vast ring seemed to breathe. There were no gun ports on it that I could find, no launch bays, no turrets. It did not need them. It was a weapon the way a glacier is a weapon, all of it, all at once, and slow and certain. They had not noticed us yet. Or no, that was wrong, and I knew it was wrong even as I thought it, the way you know a wrong thing in your gut before your head catches up. They had noticed us. They simply did not care. We had jumped in loud and ugly and slow, a single hardened hull against 3 coil ships and a captured convoy, and to the Orruun we were not a threat. We were the next thing to be stilled. They had stilled 400 years of fleets, and not one of those fleets had ever fired back, and so why would they hurry for us? Captain Quist stood at the rail of the bridge with her hands folded behind her, looking at the great breathing ring on the plot, and she was quiet for a long while. Then she said, not loudly, "There they are." "There they are, ma'am," I said. "They've got the convoy stilled, cold hulls, living crews." She did not phrase it as a question. "The Marrow too." "The Marrow too." She nodded slowly. I have thought about that nod many times since. There was no drama in it. She was a small woman, gray at the temples, and she had buried more crew than most men ever command, and when she nodded it was the nod of a carpenter looking at a wall that has to come down. "Then we'll have to take it back," she said. "Mr. Keel, set the ship to fight." I want to tell you what that meant, because it is the whole of the story, and a man who has only ever seen the elegant wars of the clever fleets will not understand it otherwise. It did not mean spinning up the directors and letting the machine take the con. We had a director computer aboard, a good one, by our standards, and in a clean fight we would have used it. We did not bring it up. Captain Quist looked at that breathing ring of conductor 11 kilometers across, the thing whose entire purpose in the universe was to kill machines, and she made the only call a hardened captain could make. She ordered the ship cold. We shut the director computer down ourselves, before the Orruun could. We dropped the main sensor array offline and went to optics. We took the reactor off automatic governance and put a man on the rods, Chief Hessam, who had run that reactor by hand in drill 1,000 times and cursed every minute of it. We cut the ship's spine into 7 sealed bays, each one a cage, each one able to fight half-blind and alone if the rest of the ship died around it. We unstrapped the manual director optics from their clamps and swung them up, and the gun chiefs put their eyes to them, and down in the mounts the loaders broke out the brass. And we waited, cold and dark and deaf by our own choice, for the Orruun to do to us the thing that had never once failed them. I had my crew at the forward director, Senior Chief Bram Odell on the optics, 2 ratings at the cranks, a midshipman named Soto plotting by hand at my elbow with a slide rule and a grease pencil, 17 years old and so frightened his ears had gone white, and so disciplined that his hands never shook. I leaned over the brass plot table, and I watched the great ring on it begin slowly to brighten. "She's building," Yale said from the optics. Her voice was flat. We trained the flatness into them. "The big one, field's coming up." "Range," I said. 290,000, closing slow. "Mr. Soto, plot the column. I want a firing solution on the lead coil laid by hand before they reach us, and I want a second solution on the middle coil behind it. Optical ranges only. Trust nothing the machine tells you, because in about 4 minutes the machine is going to be dead." "Aye, sir," Soto said, and bent to his rule, and I watched a 17-year-old boy begin, with a grease pencil, to do the arithmetic that the rest of the galaxy had handed to thinking machines 1,000 years ago. The stilling, when it came, did not come like a weapon. It came like weather. You felt it before any instrument showed it, in your teeth and in the fillings of your teeth and in the long bones of your arms, a pressure with no direction, a wrongness in the iron of the ship herself. The lamps on the plot table flared, every one of them, white and savage, and then went out. Somewhere aft a man screamed once and stopped. The deck under my boots took on a faint singing hum, the whole 11,000 tons of the iron wake ringing like a struck bell as the Orruun field grasped her and tried to make her sing in its key. And every clever machine in the ship died. I felt them go. The faint background life of a ship, the whisper of fans, the tick of governors, the half-heard murmur of automated things doing automated work, all of it stopped at once, and the iron wake fell into a silence deeper than any silence I had known, a grave silence, the silence the Orruun came to claim. This was the moment. This was the exact instant in which, 400 years running, every fleet the Orruun had ever met realized that it was already dead. The machines were gone. The guns could not be laid. The drives could not be lit. The hulls drifted, blind and deaf, full of men waiting in the dark to be boarded by a thing they could not see coming. This was the silence the Orruun built their entire civilization to make. I have wondered since what they thought in that moment, whether they felt anything we would call triumph, or whether to them the stilling of one more fleet was as unremarkable as a tide going out. Because what happened aboard the Ironwake in that silence was this. A lamp came back, not the dead electric lamps, a hand lamp, a chemical thing in a brass cage, struck a light by a rating who had carried it on his belt for exactly this. Then another. Then the battle lanterns swinging on their gimbals, a dozen of them, throwing a hard yellow light across the bridge. And in that light I saw Captain Quist standing exactly where she had been standing, hands behind her back, untroubled. And I heard her say in the silence the Orruun had made the most ordinary words in the world. "Report." And the ship reported. Not the machines, the men. Hessam on the reactor. Plant answering by hand, "Captain, I have her, she's mine." Damage parties, bay by bay, calling up through brass voice pipes because the intercom was a charred memory. Bay 1 closed up and fighting, Bay 2 closed up and fighting, Bay 3 the same, and on down the spine. The helm answering to cable and hydraulic, the great rudder vanes of the drive swinging to a wheel a man turned with his hands. The guns. Down in the mounts, the loaders had brass in the breeches, and the breeches closed, and the chiefs at the optics with their eyes already on the enemy. And they sang it up the pipe one after another in the old flat voices. Forward, mount manned and ready. A mount manned and ready. Be mount manned and ready. The litany of a ship that had just been killed and had not noticed. We were not dead. We had never been dead. The Orruun had reached into the iron wake and torn out everything clever, every machine, every elegant lattice of light and logic, every part of her that the galaxy thought was what a warship was. And underneath all of it they had found men with lamps and cranks and brass. A ship built by people who had assumed from the start that this exact moment would come, and had built for nothing else. "Mr. Odell," I said. My own voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. "Have you got the lead coil?" Bram Odell had his eye to the director optic, both hands on the brass, the great breathing ring of the anvil that sings filling his sight. "I have her, sir," he said. "Big as the sky, can't hardly miss." "Mr. Soto, solution." Soto read it off his plot in a clear, cracked boy's voice. Range and bearing and the lead. All of it worked by hand off optical ranges, while the rest of the galaxy would have been screaming into dead intercoms. I checked his arithmetic by eye out of long habit and found it good. I put my hand on the firing key. A brass key. A thing you closed with your thumb, wired straight through to the mounts in armored cable that did not care what any field did. I want to be careful here, because this is the part the clever fleets could never understand. We did not have a wonder weapon. We did not have one brilliant trick that turned the stilling against itself. We had mass drivers, rail-slung slugs of dense metal, the crudest weapon a spacefaring people can carry. No light in them, no logic, nothing for a field to grasp, just iron thrown very hard by a gun a man pointed with his eye. Against the elegant fleets of the galaxy our mass drivers were a joke. They were slow, they were short. The machines saw them coming and stepped aside. But the Orruun coil ships did not step aside. They had never had to. They had built their entire art of war on the certainty that an enemy who had been stilled could not fire at all, and so they came in close, fat and slow and certain, into the exact range at which a blind, crude, iron-throwing gun laid by a man's eye does not miss. "All mounts," I said into the pipe, "match the forward director. Stand by." "Standing by, sir." I looked once at Captain Quist. She had not moved. She gave me, in the yellow lantern light, the smallest possible nod. "Fire." The iron wake fired the way a hardened ship fires. Not in a whisper of light, but in a hammer blow you felt in the soles of your feet, the whole great ugly hull recoiling, the mounts slamming back on their tracks, the brass cases ringing on the deck plates of the magazines below. We threw iron at the anvil that sings across 240,000 kilometers of magnetar-lit dark, and because the Orruun had come in close and certain, and had never once in 400 years needed to dodge, the iron arrived. I saw it through Odell's relayed call and through the slow gathering of our half-blind optics, plot by plot on the brass table. The first salvo walked across the great breathing ring and into it. Where iron met conductor, the field that had been killing us came apart in a cascade of white fire. 10,000 kilometers of wound conductor arcing and flashing and tearing itself open as the slugs ripped through the windings. And the breathing of the great ring stuttered and faltered. And for one long heartbeat, the whole vast thing was lit from within like a struck match. And the pressure in my teeth let go. The wrongness in the bones of the ship released all at once. The anvil that sings had been pouring its whole field into us, holding us in the silence, and now its windings were torn and its certainty was bleeding out into the dark in sheets of white fire, and it could not hold us any more. "Field's collapsing," Yale said, and for the first time there was something in her flat voice, something she could not quite train out. "The big one's field is, sir, it's collapsing." "Again," I said. "Mr. Soto, walk it aft along the ring. Mr. Odell, fire as you bear, we don't stop." We did not stop. We were a cold ship full of men with lamps and brass, and we had just learned the thing the galaxy had not learned in 400 years, the thing every man on that bridge would have died never knowing if some grim old admiral had not written one sentence into our doctrine. The stilling only works on a fleet that depends on its machines. We did not depend on our machines. We had buried them ourselves before the battle even began, and gone to war with our hands. The second salvo and the third walked aft along the great ring, and the conductor tore, and the field that had drowned worlds for 4 centuries bled out into the dark of Hadron's Gate. The anvil that sings did not explode. It was too vast for that, and we were too crude. But it broke. Its breathing died. The slow rolling sheens of light went out along its windings, band by band, until 11 kilometers of Taurus hung dark and ragged against the magnetar, a cathedral with its bells torn out, and around it the 2 smaller coil ships began, for the first time in their long, undefeated history, to maneuver, to dodge, to run. They had never had to learn how. They were not good at it. We put iron across the middle coil as it turned and tore a long, bright wound down its flank, and it sheared away, venting, and did not come back. And then, in the dark, the Orruun did a thing they had not done in 400 years. They spoke. It did not come over any channel we owned, because our channels were charred. It came in the field itself, in the great failing field of the broken coil, modulated down into something our hardened sensors could just barely gather, and Yale could just barely read: a pulse, and a pattern, and then a pattern that repeated, slow and deliberate, the way you speak slowly to a thing you have only just realized can hear you. It took us the better part of an hour to be sure of what it meant, working it by hand, and we were never entirely sure, because the Orruun do not think the way we think, and a thing that has spoken in fields for 10,000 years has no easy door into a language made of breath. But the sense of it, the bones of it, came through. And the sense of it was this: they wanted it to stop. Not a threat, not a demand. The undefeated thing, the tide that had drowned the galaxy, the silence that came and claimed fleets, it had reached into the iron wake to make her drift dark like all the others, and instead it had been torn open by iron it never thought to fear, and now it lay broken in the magnetar light, and it was asking, in the only voice it had, for the iron to stop. Captain Quist listened to Yale read it up. The slow modulated pulse worked into words by hand, and she was quiet for a long time. The lanterns swung on their gimbals. The mounts down the spine sat loaded and trained and silent, every chief with his eye to the optic, waiting on the brass key under my thumb. "They've got the convoy," Quist said at last. 11 hulls, 2,000 souls in the marrow alone, sitting in cold ships they can't restart. "Aye, ma'am." "Tell them," she said, "that the iron stops when the convoy lights up. Engines, life support, the lot. They stilled those hulls, they can unstill them. They give me my people back breathing, and I leave them their broken ring to limp home in. They don't, and I take that ring apart band by band, and then I start on the next one, and I have all the iron in the world and nowhere I'd rather be." I have heard since that men tell this part of the story as a great speech, the human captain standing in triumph over the broken enemy. It was not a speech. There was no triumph in her voice. She was tired, and she was old, and she was a carpenter looking at a wall that still had to come down, and she said it the way you give the terms of a thing you would much rather not have to do. Yale worked it back into the field, pulse by pulse, slow, and we waited in the dark. And the convoy lit up. It came on raggedly, hull by hull, the way a row of windows lights in a town at dusk, first one cold ship, and then another finding its engines again, running lights blinking on, drive glow rising, and at the end of the column the great gray flank of the marrow flushing slowly back to white as her lamps came up, and 2,000 souls who had sat 4 days in the dark felt the air begin to move again. I watched it on the brass plot, hull by hull, and beside me Midshipman Sodo, 17 years old, had set down his slide rule at last and was watching the plot with his white-teared frightened face. And when the marrow's light came up, he made a sound I will not try to describe, and was not ashamed of it, and neither was I. The broken coil and its wounded sister gathered up the third, and the 3 of them turned their backs on us and limped out of Hadron's Gate into the deep dark from which they had come, the great torn ring no longer breathing, no longer singing, just a dark vast thing dragging itself home with the news. We let them go. We had our people. That was the whole of what we had come for. We never fought the Orruun again. Other ships did in the years after, and some of them were stilled and drifted dark and were lost, because not every hull in our fleet was an anvil, and not every crew had been drilled into the brass and the cold, and the dark the way the iron wakes had. But the certainty was gone. The thing the Orruun had built their entire civilization upon, that the stilling could not fail, that an enemy made silent was an enemy made dead, that certainty had been torn open at Hadron's gate by iron thrown from a gun. A frightened midshipman had aimed with arithmetic and a grease pencil, and it never closed again. An empire can survive a defeat. What it cannot survive is the loss of the one thing it believed could never fail. After the gate, every fleet they met, they had to wonder. And a tide that has to wonder is no longer a tide. I have turned it over a great many times in the years since, on long watches in that ugly ship, what it was that we taught them that night, and what it was that they taught us. What we taught them, I think, was the oldest thing there is, and the thing the clever galaxy had forgotten so completely that it took a poor and frightened people to remember it, that the machine is not the warrior. The machine is only the warrior's hand, and a hand can be cut off, and a man who has prepared for that loss, who has buried his cleverness himself before the enemy could take it, who has drilled until his hands can do in the dark what his machines did in the light, that man does not stop being a warrior when the lights go out. The Orruun had spent 10,000 years learning to take away the hand. They had simply never met anyone who had already accepted, going in, that the hand would be taken, and had built everything around the man who would still be standing when it was. And what they taught us, what I carry all these years on, is quieter, and I am not sure I have the words for it, but I will try. They taught us what it is to be on the other side of certainty. For 400 years the Orruun had come into the dark shore of the ending before it began, and they had been right every time, and being right every time had made them into something that no longer had to look at what it was killing. We broke that. And I have thought on the long watches that there is no mercy in being so sure of yourself that you stop seeing the thing in front of you, and that the kindest and the cruelest thing we ever did to the Orruun was to make them, for the first time in 10,000 years, uncertain, to make them look. They had to learn, in one bad hour in a magnetar's light, that the universe still had things in it they had not priced. That is a terrible gift to give anyone. It is also the only one that ever changes them. We went home from Hadron's gate with 11 hulls breathing behind us and 2,000 souls in the marrow who would see another sky, and a broken enemy limping the other way with the news that the dark was not theirs after all. The iron wake was cold and half-blind the whole way back. We had buried our cleverness to win, and it took us weeks to dig it up again, lamp by lamp, circuit by circuit. Nobody minded. We had won the way we had always known we would have to win if we won at all in the dark by hand, with the lights out and the brass ringing on the deck, and the old flat litany coming up the voice pipes, manned and ready, all down the spine of a ship that the whole galaxy thought was a relic, and that turned out in the one moment that mattered to be the only thing in the dark still standing. That is what the dark teaches in the end, and it is the only lesson I have ever fully trusted, that everything clever will fail you at the worst possible moment, and that the only question that has ever mattered is whether you decided, long before the dark came, who you would be when it did. We decided early, we always had, that is the whole of it, and it is enough.